You know, when you get to be my age, you think you've seen every twist life can throw at you. I was wrong. Everything in my world spun out of control the day after my son Brian's funeral. The sun was cold over Dallas that morning, but the coldest thing was the words from my daughter-in-law, Rachel. She'd always been sharp, but that day, she cut right through me. At the reading of the will, Rachel leaned close and hissed, "Don't expect a cent from Brian's estate. You're getting nothing. I promise you that." But the family lawyer, Tom Barker, a good man Brian had trusted for years, just smiled and said, "There's one more clause, actually. The most important one." That's when Rachel's face went from smug to ghostly pale. She swayed in her chair like someone had pulled the ground out from under her. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Earlier that week, I stood at Brian's grave in Oakwood Memorial, my hands shaking, trying to keep the funeral program from tearing. Rachel stood a few feet away, already scrolling through her phone, not a tear on her face. She spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Finally, I can start living again. These last months were hell. Brian was a burden." I felt my heart freeze. People stopped their quiet conversations and glanced at us. Some, like Linda, Brian's old friend from childhood, drifted closer, trying to offer comfort, but I could barely breathe. Rachel tossed her phone into her expensive purse and said, "He was my husband, Frank, not your son anymore. And now, everything's mine." She walked to her car, a flashy BMW Brian bought her 2 Christmases ago, without looking back. I wondered if she'd ever truly loved my boy, or if his sickness was just a delay to her plans. As the mourners left, I stood alone by the grave. Memories flooded my mind. Brian as a kid, always inventing something in our dusty old garage. "Dad, why does everyone make model planes silver?" he'd ask, holding up a jet he'd painted bright blue and yellow. "I want mine to stand out." He never did follow the crowd. Those years went by in a flash, and Brian's stubborn creativity carried him far. He got into Stanford on a scholarship, built an app that made a fortune, and even after his mother died, he always found time to call me Sunday nights. When his app sold for millions, he drove all the way to my house outside Dallas, pulled up in his old truck, and handed me a bottle of champagne. "You're retiring, Dad," he said, "and I'm buying you that woodshop you always dreamed of." That woodshop still stands behind my house. I haven't built much lately. My hands are stiff, and after Brian got sick, all I did was care for him. The worst day of my life was the day he called and told me, "Dad, I've got cancer. But I'm going to fight. Stage 3 pancreatic." The doctors at Methodist Hospital were kind, but we both knew the odds. Rachel, at first, played the dutiful wife. She organized appointments, asked about treatments, told me she had everything under control. But a few months in, she started disappearing. "I can't take this anymore," she said one night while Brian slept. "You do it, Frank. He needs someone stronger." By that summer, I was living in their guest room, cooking meals Brian could swallow, helping him with medicine, watching my son fade day by day. Rachel buried herself in her business, but the truth was she was waiting, planning her escape. She didn't know Brian was planning, too. He met secretly with Tom Barker, the lawyer, for hours at a time. "Dad," Brian told me once, "don't worry about the future. Just trust Tom when the time comes." I told him not to talk like that, but he just smiled. I know who cares about me. The day after the funeral, Rachel told me I had to leave the house. "You're not on the deed. Brian rented you a room. That rental ends with his death." She handed me a folder with a rental agreement. Her voice was ice. 15 minutes, or I'm calling the police for trespassing." I stood on the steps of the house where I'd cared for my dying son, staring at my suitcases on the porch. She watched me pack, arms folded, as if she couldn't wait to erase me. I drove away, 3 bags in the back of my battered Buick, feeling like I'd lost not just my son, but my home, my family, everything. That night, in a cheap motel outside Dallas, I spread out the documents Rachel gave me. My hands shook with anger and grief. I found Tom Barker's card in my wallet and called him. "Come to my office tomorrow," he said. "There are things you need to know about Brian's will. He wanted you protected." I didn't sleep much that night. But I held on to the last thing Brian said to me. "Dad, trust Tom. I made sure you'll be okay." And for the first time since the funeral, a small, stubborn hope began to grow in my chest. I spent 4 nights in that faded motel, the kind of place where the coffee tastes like old cardboard and the walls are thin enough to hear your neighbor's TV through the night. Every morning I'd wake at sunrise, look out at the Texas highway, and feel like I was waking up in someone else's life. Everything I owned fit in 3 suitcases and a cardboard box of model airplanes Brian and I built together. The woodshop he bought me, all my tools, and even the photos of my late wife, those were still at Rachel's house. I wondered if I'd ever see any of it again. The only thing that kept me moving was Brian's words. "Trust Tom. I made sure you'll be okay." So, on the 5th morning, I put on my best suit, still smelling faintly of the cemetery and cologne I wore to Brian's wedding, and drove downtown to Tom Barker's office. The building was modern, glass shining under the Dallas sun, a far cry from the old brick courthouse I used to visit in my engineering days. Tom greeted me with a firm handshake and the kind of kindness you only see from someone who truly respected your son. "Frank, I'm glad you came. Brian wanted every detail handled properly. You'll need coffee for this." He poured a cup from a silver pot that looked like it belonged at a 5-star hotel. I slid the rental agreement across the table. "Rachel threw me out the day of the funeral. She says I was just a tenant. Is this even legal?" Tom examined the papers with a frown. "It's legal, Frank. Rachel technically had the right to terminate the lease. But that's not the end of the story." He pushed a heavy stack of documents in front of me. Brian was methodical. He planned for every scenario, especially one where Rachel made things difficult. The will reading was scheduled for Friday at 2 p.m. "Rachel will be there with her lawyer," Tom said. "But you should know, Brian left instructions for other witnesses, Linda from the family, and Brian's business partner, Greg." That made me feel a little less alone. I spent the next 2 days pacing the motel room, wearing out the ugly carpet, my mind racing with worry. What if Rachel was right? What if Brian's illness had left him vulnerable? The doubt crept in during the dark hours, but every time, I'd remember how sharp Brian had stayed, even in his final weeks. Friday came with a harsh wind. I put on my suit again and drove to the office. Tom's conference room was filled with nervous energy. Rachel, in a designer black suit and expensive jewelry. Her attorney, a woman with a face like cold marble. Greg, looking anxious and a bit out of place in his too large blazer. And Linda, clutching her purse with both hands. Rachel's voice was loud, brittle. "Frank, you don't need to be here. Everything belongs to me as Brian's wife. The law is clear." Tom raised his hand. "Let's read the will." He read the legal preamble, and Rachel practically vibrated with confidence as the list of assets went her way: house, cars, bank accounts. "See?" she hissed. "I told you." But Tom didn't stop. "There are additional bequests." He turned the page and read. "To my father, Frank Reynolds, who cared for me when I was at my lowest, I leave 50% ownership of Reynolds Innovations, including all shares and dividend rights." The room froze. Rachel's attorney actually dropped her pen. "What? That can't be." Rachel's face strained of color. Greg looked at me, eyes wide with hope. "Additionally," Tom continued, "my father is to receive the full contents of the woodshop, all tools, and the sum of $120,000 from the Memorial Fund." Rachel bolted to her feet, her chair skidding. "This is fraud. He was sick. This is manipulation." She spun on Tom. "You'll regret this. I'll contest everything in court." Tom's voice was calm but steely. "Brian left a final condition. If Rachel ever evicts Frank from the house within a year of his death, all assets revert to Frank, house, accounts, everything." Rachel looked like she'd been slapped. Her lawyer stammered something about undue influence, but Tom just said, "Brian anticipated this. There's a video statement. Frank, would you like to watch it now?" I nodded, my hands trembling. Tom set up a small monitor and pressed play. Brian's face appeared, gaunt but determined. "Dad, if you're seeing this, it means Rachel made her choice. I'm sorry you had to go through that. But I want you safe. I want you to have what you need. Use it well. And Rachel, if you're watching, know that love without kindness isn't love at all." Silence filled the room. Rachel's eyes narrowed with rage. "This isn't over." I felt a wave of emotions, shock, grief, and a gratitude so deep it hurt. My son had protected me from beyond the grave. He'd seen the truth about Rachel, about loyalty, and about the kind of love that survives even death. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. But inside, I felt, for the first time in weeks, like the ground beneath my feet might finally steady. I left Tom Barker's office with my mind whirling and my hands still trembling. Rachel's threat, "This isn't over," echoed in my ears long after I'd stepped into the elevator. I tried to tell myself it was just bluster, the tantrum of someone who'd finally been told no. But I knew Rachel too well. When she felt cornered, she lashed out. By the time I reached the parking lot, my phone was already buzzing with calls from an unknown number. I didn't answer. Instead, I drove back to the motel, my heart thumping in my chest. I sat for a long time in the faded armchair, staring at the little model airplane I'd built with Brian. I traced the crooked blue stripes with my thumb, thinking of all the plans we'd made together, all the unfinished dreams. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Rachel's voice, sometimes pleading, sometimes furious. She'd lost everything not because of me, but because she'd revealed who she really was. Still, I worried. She had money for lawyers, and the fight wasn't truly over. But for the first time since Brian died, I felt like I had some power, however small. The following week was a blur of paperwork and appointments. Tom called often, walking me through the transition of shares, the paperwork for the woodshop, the bank accounts. "Brian really thought of everything, Frank," he said one afternoon. "He even set up a trust so your legal costs would be covered, no matter how long Rachel drags this out." "Why would he do all that?" I asked. Tom's voice was soft. "Because he loved you. And because he knew what Rachel was capable of." I spent hours with Greg, Brian's business partner, reviewing the company's operations. "Brian always said you were the most practical man he knew," Greg told me, shuffling through spreadsheets. "He wanted you to help keep the company honest. I know it's a lot to take in, but I'm glad it's you." I tried to keep my focus on business, but the truth was, my mind kept drifting back to my son. Everywhere I looked, at Greg's nervous smile, at the little woodshop keys in my pocket, I saw Brian's fingerprints. It comforted me and broke my heart at the same time. Rachel, meanwhile, was on the warpath. She filed a motion to contest the will, hiring one of Dallas's most aggressive attorneys. Her strategy was to claim Brian was mentally unfit in his last months. The court ordered medical records, and Tom, ever prepared, produced letters from Brian's oncologist and hospice nurse. "Mr. Reynolds remained of sound mind and clear judgment through all business and legal decisions." Rachel tried another tactic, smearing my name in the local press. She gave an interview to a TV reporter, painting herself as the grieving widow cheated out of her rightful inheritance by a scheming old man. Watching her speak with tears she never shed at Brian's funeral made my stomach turn. I called Linda, who'd been Brian's friend since high school. "She's desperate, Frank," Linda said. People who know the truth will stand with you. I'll testify if you need me to. Other friends reached out, too, former colleagues, neighbors, even Brian's old college roommate. The community remembered how Rachel behaved during Brian's illness. They remembered her absence, her complaints, her expensive shopping trips while Brian fought for his life. I collected their statements and gave them to Tom. The legal battle dragged on for months. Each court date brought more stress, more paperwork, more bitter words from Rachel's team. Sometimes I wondered if it would ever end, if I'd ever feel at home in the world again. I spent my nights at the motel and my days bouncing between court and the business office. But I wasn't alone. Linda stopped by often, bringing homemade meals and gentle conversation. Greg became a steady partner at work, always willing to listen. Even Tom started to feel more like a friend than a lawyer. And at the center of it all was Brian's voice, on old voicemails, in letters he'd left for me, and in my memories. One cold morning in December, Tom called with news. "Rachel's attorney wants to settle," he said. "They know they can't win. She's out of money, and the judge has ruled the will stands. You're going home, Frank." I felt tears on my cheeks for the first time in months. I drove to the house, my house, now, legally and finally. The front lawn was a mess, the mailbox stuffed with angry letters and unpaid bills. But inside, the workshop waited. My hands shook as I unlocked the door and saw Brian's tools, exactly as he'd left them. The war was over. I could finally grieve in peace, surrounded by the love my son left behind. The day I stepped back into that house, the Texas air felt clearer than it had in months. There was no crowd, no Rachel lurking by the door, no more threats or legal documents. Just silence, and the creak of old floorboards under my feet. I carried my suitcases and myself, every muscle aching but my heart finally lighter. I wandered from room to room, letting the memories come, Brian as a boy, running down the hall with a model plane in each hand, the echo of his laughter from the backyard, my wife's photo still on the mantel. Dust had settled on everything, but the house didn't feel hostile anymore. It felt empty, yes, but it was finally mine. Not a guest, not a tenant. Just a man coming home. The first thing I did was visit the workshop. It stood just as Brian left it. There were half-finished projects on the bench, wood shavings on the floor, and a handwritten note taped above the tool rack. "Dream big, Dad." I stood there for a long time, breathing in the sawdust and remembering our best days, Saturdays building birdhouses, arguing over the right way to fix a warped board, Brian insisting that good enough was never enough. The ache in my chest was both pain and pride. Life settled into a new routine. I met with Greg almost every morning. Together we steered Reynolds Innovations through its first year without Brian. Sometimes we disagreed, but I knew every decision I made was with my son's legacy in mind. Tom handled the last of the paperwork, and Linda kept me grounded, always reminding me to eat, to rest, to live. She told me once, "Brian would be proud, Frank. He'd want you to use this second chance." For a while, the quiet felt strange. No Rachel banging around the kitchen, no hospice nurses bustling in and out, no court dates looming over my head. I started cooking again, the way my wife used to, though nothing tasted quite as good as her pot roast. Linda came by for dinner sometimes, and for the first time in years, the house filled with laughter that wasn't forced. But Rachel didn't disappear completely. She lingered in angry emails and the occasional letter from her lawyer, but she was powerless now. The court had ruled. Every attempt to challenge the will was dismissed. The judge's words rang in my ears. The testator's intentions were clear, the conditions fully legal. The estate is settled. The neighborhood, too, seemed to change. Old friends who'd kept their distance during the legal battle now waved from their porches, or stopped by to bring casseroles and pie. Some were just curious. Everyone loves a good scandal, but most were genuinely supportive. They'd seen what Rachel was, and what Brian had planned for. I started to think about what to do with my new life. The business was thriving, but I was never meant to sit behind a desk all day. My true joy was in the workshop. I threw myself into it, making everything from toy cars for the neighbor kids to custom cabinets for Greg's kitchen. There was satisfaction in working with my hands, in creating something solid and lasting, something that wouldn't betray or disappoint. One evening, as the Texas sun set pink and gold behind the backyard, Linda joined me on the porch. She brought lemonade, and we talked about everything but the past: her garden, Greg's plans for the company, the way the world just keeps spinning, even when your own has stopped. "You know, Frank," she said, "maybe it's time you did something for yourself. Travel. Take a class. Do all those things you put off when Brian was sick." I thought about that for a long time after she left. I realized that, for the first time in years, the future wasn't just something to endure. It was something to plan for. There were still tough nights, of course. Grief doesn't keep a schedule. Some evenings I'd find myself at the kitchen table with a glass of whiskey and nothing but silence for company. Sometimes I'd hear Brian's voice, real as memory, reminding me to keep going, to look for the next project. The love of a son doesn't fade with time, and neither does the ache of losing him. But every time I picked up a hammer, or smoothed the rough edge of pine, I felt Brian close by. In the whir of the saw, in the smell of wood, in the light that slanted through the window just right, I was building more than shelves or birdhouses. I was building my way back to life. With the legal storms behind me and the workshop humming with new projects, I should have felt satisfied, maybe even happy. But the truth is, after so many years as a husband and a father, and then as a caretaker and a fighter, it's hard to just become Frank again. Every morning, I'd wake early, coffee in hand, and watch the sun rise through the backyard window. Sometimes I felt the loneliness as sharply as the Texas wind. But life, as I'd learned, moves forward. One morning Greg knocked on my door with a stack of papers under his arm and an excitement in his eyes. "Frank, I want to show you something," he said, spreading out charts and reports on my kitchen table. "Brian left notes about an education fund, a scholarship for kids who want to study engineering but don't have the means. I think we should do it." The idea hit me straight in the chest. Brian's dream had always been to help people build their own future. He'd seen how education changed his life, and mine. We talked for hours, laying out a plan for the Reynolds Scholarship, a program to send working-class kids to college, no strings attached. For the first time since Brian's funeral, I felt a spark in my gut, purpose, real and new. Linda was the first to join our little committee, organizing fundraising and spreading the word. Soon, neighbors and local businesses were donating. Even some of the people who'd once sided with Rachel came around, wanting to be part of something good. The scholarship got a mention in the local paper, and I received a letter from a single mother in Lubbock whose son wanted to be an engineer. "Thank you for giving my boy a chance," she wrote. I kept that letter pinned above my workbench. The work gave me structure. My days were full: meetings, planning sessions, phone calls with the college board. But my evenings still belonged to the workshop. That's where I let my thoughts settle, where grief and hope mingled in the sound of saws and the smell of cedar. Sometimes Linda would drop by, and we'd share stories, old music playing softly in the background. But Rachel, true to her nature, couldn't let things go. She found a new lawyer, sent more threatening letters, and even tried to rally some old family friends to her side. This time, though, her words didn't carry much weight. Too many people had seen her real face during the trial. Even her last supporters grew silent. When her final appeal was dismissed, Rachel sent me a single email. "You stole my future. You'll regret this." I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling nothing. The anger was gone. All I felt was pity. She'd lost not because of me, but because she'd mistaken cruelty for strength. Brian had seen it long before I did. With Rachel finally gone from my daily life, the house became a place of peace again. I hosted neighbors for backyard barbecues and taught some of the local kids how to build birdhouses, just as Brian and I once had. Greg's family came over for Sunday dinners, filling the rooms with laughter and the smell of roast chicken. Even Linda started leaving her gardening gloves on my porch, a silent promise she'd always return. That summer, we awarded our first 3 scholarships. At the ceremony, I handed out the checks, my hands only slightly less steady than my heart. Each recipient had a story: overcoming loss, working 2 jobs, helping raise siblings. Each time I looked in their eyes, I saw a bit of Brian's spirit, curious, determined, a little bit stubborn. I shook every hand, offering the same words my son once told me: dream big. Don't let anyone tell you what you can't do. After the ceremony, I stood outside under the big Texas sky, feeling the weight of years finally lifting. The world had taken so much from me, but in return, it had given me a new kind of family, and a purpose that reached beyond grief. The ache of losing Brian was still there. Maybe it always would be, but I felt something else, too: gratitude. For the time we'd shared, for the lessons learned, and for the chance to pass them on. As the sun dipped low, casting golden light across the yard, I realized Brian was still with me, in every act of kindness, every piece of hope I helped build. And for the first time in a long while, I looked toward tomorrow with something close to joy. That autumn was the most peaceful I'd felt in years. The days grew cooler, the leaves in the yard turning crisp and red, and the workshop filled with the quiet rhythm of old habits returning. My hands, once so used to care and worry, now found comfort in creation, building shelves, restoring old furniture, and sometimes, late at night, tinkering with the unfinished plane Brian and I had started together in better days. The house slowly transformed from a place of sorrow back into a home. Greg's kids drew chalk drawings on the driveway. Linda's laughter floated through the kitchen window. Even neighbors I hadn't seen in years stopped by to say hello. Life, in its slow, stubborn way, was beginning again. The scholarship fund grew faster than any of us expected. Letters poured in from students all over Texas, and even a few from Oklahoma and Arkansas. Each one was a reminder that Brian's reach extended far beyond what I'd ever imagined. At our kitchen table, I'd read stories of kids who worked nights to help their families, of girls who dreamed of building bridges, of boys who wanted to invent things that would make the world better. I saw Brian in every page: the stubborn hope, the restless drive, the belief that anyone could build something lasting if only given a chance. Linda became my closest confidant. Some evenings we'd sit on the porch, talking long after the stars came out. She told me about losing her own husband to cancer, the dark years after, and how friendship, and then, perhaps, something gentler, helped her heal. "It's strange, Frank," she said one night, her hand resting lightly on mine. "Sometimes you think the world is done with you. But then you find out you've still got a little love left to give." I didn't know what the future would bring, but I was grateful for her company. There was no grand romance, nothing rushed or desperate. Just 2 old friends learning to trust the world again, one slow evening at a time. Of course, I still missed Brian every day. Some mornings I'd wake up expecting to hear his voice, calling me from the workshop, asking for help with a project or advice on life. Other times, I'd find myself picking up my phone to send him a photo or a joke, only to remember he was gone. Grief is a strange companion, sometimes sharp and insistent, sometimes just a dull ache in the bones. But the ache grew quieter as the days went on. The love stayed. One day, I received a call from Stanford University. A young woman named Mia, the first Reynolds Scholar, wanted to thank me personally. She was majoring in mechanical engineering and had just started a robotics club with the scholarship funds. "I wouldn't be here without Brian," she told me over the phone, her voice brimming with hope. "Someday I want to help kids like me, too." After we hung up, I stood in the workshop for a long time, looking at the purple and gold plane Brian and I never finished. That afternoon, I set to work, sanding, gluing, painting, just as we'd done years ago. I didn't rush. I let the memories come and go as they pleased. I listened to old country songs and the sound of the wind in the trees. As the final coat dried, I realized something. This was what Brian had always wanted. Not just for me to survive, but to build again. To carry love forward, not just memories. Thanksgiving came and the house was full. Linda brought pie, Greg brought his family, and even the first scholarship students joined us for dinner. The kitchen buzzed with life. We ate, laughed, and toasted to absent friends, to dreams fulfilled, and to new beginnings. That night, after everyone had gone, I stepped out into the cool darkness, the old model plane in my hands. I held it up to the porch light, watching the colors shine, and whispered, "We did it, son! We made it through!" And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel alone. Winter settled over Dallas with a gentle hush, the kind that softens old hurts and invites reflection. The house, once echoing with loss, was now alive with the quiet pulse of new routines. Mornings with fresh coffee, afternoons in the workshop, evenings full of friendship and memory. My heart, once so raw, found comfort in these small rituals, in the steady return of hope. The scholarship fund grew beyond anything Brian or I had dreamed. By Christmas, we'd helped send a dozen students to college, each one writing back with gratitude and news of their successes. One was already interning at an aerospace firm, another had been accepted to graduate school at MIT. Their victories became mine, and I found a kind of fatherly pride in each accomplishment. Every envelope, every phone call, felt like Brian reaching out through time, proof that love leaves a mark no bitterness can erase. Linda became a fixture in my life. We shared simple joys, a walk through the park, tending the winter garden, laughing at old photos. There was no need for grand declarations. Companionship, I'd learned, was as healing as any medicine. "You know, Frank," she said one snowy afternoon, "sometimes the best kind of love is the one you build quietly, brick by brick." We planned a small holiday gathering, the first in years. Greg brought his family, the scholarship students arrived with their stories, and the house glowed with a warmth I'd thought was lost forever. After dinner, I stood by the old woodshop, watching the younger kids race through the backyard with handmade planes, each one painted in bright, stubborn colors, just like Brian would have done. Later that night, as the last guests left, Mia, our first Reynolds scholar, lingered on the porch. She handed me a card, inside the words, "Thank you for believing in me before I believed in myself. I hope I make you and Brian proud." I felt tears prick my eyes, but this time they were soft, not bitter. As the new year began, I looked back on everything that had happened, the loss, the betrayal, the long legal battle, the unexpected blessings. I realized that even the deepest wounds could become seeds for something beautiful if tended with patience, faith, and a bit of stubborn love. One afternoon, as winter gave way to the first hint of spring, I took the finished model plane, the purple and gold one Brian and I had never completed, out to the backyard. The sky was clear, the air brisk but full of promise. With trembling hands, I gave it one final check, then let it fly. The little plane soared higher than I expected, catching the light just right, spinning in a way that would have made Brian grin from ear to ear. Linda clapped from the porch, Greg's kids cheered, and for a moment, I swear I could almost hear Brian's laughter on the wind. I watched until the plane drifted to a gentle landing among the wildflowers. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, writing a letter to myself, a tradition I'd started to keep track of what mattered most. I wrote about the journey from grief to gratitude, about the power of forgiveness and the quiet strength of community. I wrote about Brian, about Linda, about the kids whose lives would be changed by the scholarship in years to come. And I promised myself to keep building, to keep dreaming, to keep loving, no matter how uncertain the world might seem. Looking back, I saw how Brian's greatest gift wasn't the money, the company, or even the house. It was the lesson that family is built on kindness, and that real legacy isn't what you leave behind, but what you set in motion. When I finished the letter, I placed it beside the old photo of Brian and me in the workshop, both of us beaming, hands covered in paint and glue. The ache in my heart was still there, but so was a peace I hadn't known was possible. The world outside was quiet, the sky full of stars. I stood up, stretched, and went out to the porch for one last breath of cool night air. "Thank you, son," I whispered to the wind, "for teaching me that life is always worth living and loving, no matter how hard it gets." And with that, I turned off the porch light, closed the door behind me, and walked back into my home, ready, at last, for whatever came next.